The Bible is a sacred story, echoed to us from the ancients. An epic, revealing the great Creator's pursuit of wholeness for all of creation. May we find ourselves in this amazing story. The Creator, a great and mysterious being called God, hovered over the dark waters of the earth. As God spoke, creation took shape. God pushed back darkness from light, separated sky from water, and surfaced land from the seas. God filled the air, land, and water with every kind of creature. Then, God formed a new creature to reflect God's own image. Humans were entrusted by God to care for all living things. Looking over creation, God thought, "This is very good." Then God rested and set aside a day for humans to rest and enjoy being with God. God tried to protect the humans from knowing too much too soon. But the humans ignored God's instructions. They gave in to temptation, believing they could have God's wisdom right away. Soon, they began to experience struggles, and pain, and death. Before long, civilizations emerged, but humans couldn't live peacefully apart from God's ways. Selfishness turned into hatred, murder, and war. The earth was filled with chaos. God's heart broke. So God sent a terrible flood, washing it all away. But God never gave up hope. In fact, God promised to bless the entire world again. It would all start through a man named Abraham. God made this sacred promise to him. God said, "Look around. As far as you can see, this promised land is for your family. Look up and try to count the stars. That's how many will be in your family. They will be my blessing to the entire world." Abraham and his wife Sarah laughed in disbelief. How could this come true? We've never been able to have children, and now we're too old. But they weren't too old for a miracle. After 25 years of waiting, they had a son and named him Isaac, which means laughter. Just as God promised, the number of Abraham's descendants grew and grew. These special people were named after Israel, Abraham's grandson. Israel had 12 sons of his own. When famine struck their promised land, they moved to Egypt. There, the Israelites' numbers grew and grew. Egypt's King Pharaoh felt threatened by them and forced them into slavery. In their suffering, the Israelites cried out to God. God answered with incredible signs and wonders. God also sent a humble leader named Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. God split a wide sea, giving them a narrow escape path from Pharaoh's armies. The Israelites danced and sang in celebration. Their journey had just begun. The people of Israel were about to embark on a long trek through the desert in hope of returning to their promised land. God guided them with a pillar of fire at night and a towering cloud by day. God gave Moses commands and laws to instruct Israel in the best ways to live. But the people rebelled and worshipped a golden idol. This enraged Moses and God. So Israel had to wander in the desert for 40 years. 40 years of complaining and conflict. But God did not abandon Israel. God dwelled in the center of their camp in a sacred tent called a tabernacle. Eventually, the Israelites returned to the Promised Land, but they faced great conflict from outside and within their new kingdom. Let's continue their story right now.
Hi, 6th graders. Welcome back to Confirmation. We are in session 7 of 8 this fall. We are so close to being done. The finish line is in sight. We are going to continue today following the Israelites through the Old Testament as we continue to talk about the 5 C's of the Bible. Today, we have 2 scenes. Scene 1 is Saul, and scene 2 is David. We're going to start with scene 1. After wandering in the desert for 40 years, the Israelites finally returned home to the Promised Land. God warned them, "You must completely drive out all the corrupt people in this Promised Land, or they will give you endless troubles, and you'll become just like them." Now, the Israelites did not listen to this warning, and before long, they began to live like the corrupt people among them, taking on their destructive ways and worshiping their idols. They were selfish, and they did whatever they wanted. And in the midst of all this chaos, the Israelites began to be conquered and attacked by neighboring nations. And they began to suffer under enemy rule, and they cried out to God. They begged for help. So God inspired wise and courageous leaders called judges to rescue them. Each judge led Israel to defeat their enemies and guided them back to living in God's ways. But at the end of each judge's life, the Israelites went right back to their evil ways, and they rejected God once again. Until the next judge came along, and they were attacked, and they begged God for help. Time after time, God had compassion on the Israelites, and sent another judge to rescue them. And this cycle continued for generation and generation. Eventually, the Israelites wanted to be like the nations around them. They wanted a human king to rule over them. And God said, "You are rejecting me as your king. Be warned, human kings will control you and take everything you have." But the Israelites didn't listen again. And so God chose a very tall and handsome man named Saul to rule over Israel. Right away, King Saul and his armies drove out Israel's enemies and defended their borders. But just like God had warned, Saul treated the Israelites harshly, and he didn't always follow God's ways. God was not pleased with Saul, and he chose David to be the next king. Well, he was just a boy tending sheep. Now, Saul didn't know anything about this, and David's time to be king was still very far away. Meanwhile, Saul was overcome with anxiety and depression. He had musicians come and play for him in hopes that it would help his troubled mind. And one of these musicians was none other than David. David came to the palace every day to play his stringed instruments for the king. And David's music helped Saul to feel better. Soon the king grew to love David and made him out to be one of his most trusted servants. David also became best friends with Saul's son. And later, David even married Saul's daughter. Before long, King Saul appointed David to command his armies. David had great success in battle and became so popular that the Israelites wrote songs about him. Now, this might sound awesome, but it made Saul so angry and so jealous. Why are they giving David all the credit? Next, they'll make him king, he said. So the next time that David was playing music for Saul, King Saul became overcome with madness and rage. And he picked up a spear and he hurled it at David. And David dodged the spear, but the king kept attacking, determined to kill him. Scene 2. David. Shocked and terrified, David ran from Saul and hid in a cave. Saul's army searched high and low for David, but They couldn't find him. Cold and hungry and afraid, David poured out his heart to God through music that we call now the Psalms. He's saying, God, you are my rock, my fortress. You are the one who rescues me. Others were running from the king too, and they hid with David in this cave. And this group of fugitives joined together to fight for Israel, even though King Saul and his armies were searching for them. Twice, David was close enough to Saul to kill him and take over as king, and his ragtag group of followers pleaded with him. They said, this king is crazy, now's your chance. But David refused and said, I would never harm the king. He was chosen by God. So soon after that, Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in battle. And when David heard the news, he was heartbroken. He was so filled with sadness that he wrote a song to honor them at their funeral. And before long, the leaders of Israel asked David to be the new king. King David did what was good and right for all the people, uniting them to follow God's ways. David loved God deeply, but he wasn't perfect. One afternoon, David looked out from his palace window and noticed a beautiful woman bathing below. And he found out who she was, that she was the wife of one of his generals. And so David brought her up to the palace and slept with her, and she became pregnant. And to hide what he had done, David gave orders to have that general stranded on the front lines of battle, where he was easily killed. One of David's closest advisors, named Nathan, knew what David had done. And instead of confronting him directly, Nathan told him a story about a rich man who took a poor man's sheep, even though the rich man had plenty of his own. And at the end of the story, David said, that rich man must be punished. And Nathan said, David, that rich man is you. You took something that wasn't yours. And David fell on his face in shame. David broke down and cried, I've done something against God. Nathan comforted him and said, God will forgive you and spare your life, but your son's life will not be spared. And soon after that, David's young son became very ill, and he died. And after David grieved for his son, he went to the tabernacle to pray and worship God. After this, David went on to rule as king for many, many years. He was loved by God and loved by all the people of Israel. God told David, I've been with you since you were a boy, tending sheep. You have followed me with all your heart. Now you will be known throughout history. From you and your family will come many kings, and a final kingdom that will never end. You see, just like God promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have land and be a blessing and have descendants that number like the stars, God promised David that someone from his family would always be on the throne. And as we'll see as we continue to study and learn together, God keeps that promise too.